Chapter 7. Mrs. Bramble's Warning. Lady Tremain's head was spinning after the dinner party. The evening already swirled in her memory like a dream. She tried to hold on to every moment to form a clear memory she should cherish forever, but it slipped through her fingers, leaving her with fragments. She could hardly believe it was all happening, and so quickly. One moment she thought it was all a misunderstanding, and the next they were engaged. After dinner, Lady Hackle arranged for champagne, chocolates, and fruit in the library so Lady Tremaine and Sir Richard could have a few moments alone before he sailed to the many kingdoms. I'm sorry to dash off like this when we have so much left to discuss, but I have been summoned by my king, and it's my duty to attend to him the moment I'm called to his side. It is my express wish, however, that you and your daughters join me as soon as you are able, he said, kissing her hand. I hope you understand. She wanted to say she did, but she didn't. Won't you come back with me to the many kingdoms now? I hate the idea of delaying your journey any longer than necessary. He kissed her hand again, then squeezed it in his own. And what of my girls, Richard? I can't go ahead without them. Lady Tremaine shook her head. Of course I'll leave Mrs. Hackle's immediately so I can join you as soon as possible, but this is all happening so quickly. There are things that must be considered, plans to be made. My household needs to be packed and shipped, and there is the matter of my servants. I will have to arrange passage for them, as well as for myself and my girls. My goodness, I have to tell the girls. They're going to be blindsided, she said, as Sir Richard took her other hand in his. There is no need to bring anything other than your personal belongings, Lady Tremaine. My chateau is beautifully furnished and fully staffed. Bring your lady's maid and governess for a company for you and your girls during the journey, if you wish, but we won't be in need of them once you are settled into your new home. But come quickly and with haste. I need you by my side, he said, looking deeply into her eyes. Just then there was a knock at the door, and Sir Richard's valet entered. Excuse me, but we must be going. Sir Richard's carriage must depart now if he's to make the ship to the many kingdoms. Very well, I'll be there in a moment, Sir Richard said. I'd better be off. My king needs me, he said, squeezing her hands a little tighter. Lady Tremaine thought in that moment he would kiss her. They were engaged, after all. It could hardly be inappropriate. They had both married before, and she was no maiden. She closed her eyes waiting for it, and then she felt his lips chastely brush her forehead. Goodbye, my dear. Come to me quickly. I can't wait for you to be my wife, he said. She stood there, looking into his eyes, and wondered, still, if he loved her. Perhaps he was uncomfortable kissing her in front of the valet. She wanted to ask, but couldn't bring herself to. Lady Tremaine went up to her room and collapsed onto the bed with a deep sigh. She lay there in the dark, trying to catch her breath, but was startled by a familiar, gravely voice coming from the corner of the room. I see you are already besotted by your prince, and you have forgotten all about your poor Mrs. Bramble. Lady Tremaine shot up out of bed. She didn't know how she had missed her before, but now she could make out Mrs. Bramble's silhouette in a velvet chair by the window. The moonlight shone on her wild silver hair and cast shadows on her face, making her look like an old crone from a fairy tale. He's not a prince, said Lady Tremaine, standing up and straightening her dress. He's a knight, and of course I have not forgotten about you, Mrs. Bramble. How are you feeling? She made her way over to the poor woman. I'm in a sorry state, alone in the world without a friend, Mrs. Bramble said, her eyes watery and yellow from age. You are not alone, Mrs. Bramble. You have me, said Lady Tremaine. You don't need me any more. You're sending me away, don't you deny it. The witch's girl told me so. It's clear she and your fairy tale prince have you in their clutches. Lady Tremaine kneeled down so she could look her in the eye. Stop this now. What's this talk of witches? I am in no one's clutches, she said. She was sorry to see Mrs. Bramble in such a state. Rebecca said you're sending me to live with my sister, said Mrs. Bramble, and that you're moving to the many kingdoms. Lady Tremaine shook her head. Well, I can hardly say how would know I was going to the many kingdoms when I have just decided to go myself. Mrs. Bramble cackled. It was an ugly, raspy laugh that made Lady Tremain's teeth itch. Oh, you knew how you were going off with him the moment you laid eyes on him. You're already under their spell. You were always a fool for a handsome face and a fat purse, she said, laughing again. Now that is enough. Lady Tremaine got up and walked to the center of the room. I don't know what's come over you, Mrs. Bramble, but you must pull yourself together. I won't have you speaking to me like this, she said, pulling the cord to call Rebecca. Mark my words, dearie, you will regret it if you go to the many kingdoms. Please, just read the book of fairy tales I gave you. It's all in there. Then you will see why I'm so worried about you, said Mrs. Bramble with imploring eyes. I wish there was something I could say to ease your mind, Mrs. Bramble. Lady Tremaine eyed the door, waiting for Rebecca to knock and put an end to this conversation. I assure you, I will be very happy with Sir Richard. She was worried for the woman's state of mind. There is a special bond between a nanny and her charge, as you will learn in the pages of that book. I've always seen you very clearly, and I know beyond a doubt that something horrible will happen if you leave. Lady Tremaine took her hand. She wondered if the poor dear wasn't suffering from some sort of dementia from old age. Why are you so convinced something terrible will happen to me? She asked. Why do you think someone will hurt me? She searched the old woman's face, wondering what made her look so heart-sickened. I'm not worried you will be hurt, my little one. You're a strong woman, and you can handle anything those witches try to cast your way, said Mrs. Bramble. Then what has you so worried? What are you so afraid of? Asked Lady Tremaine, and the strangest look came over Mrs. Bramble's face. Oh, my dear, don't you see? I'm worried about those you may hurt, those you will destroy with your hate and cruelty. Rebecca walked into the room just then and heard what Mrs. Bramble said. That's utter nonsense. My lady doesn't have a cruel bone in her body, Rebecca said. Oh, your lady will after you and your witches are done with her, Mrs. Bramble croaked. It happens to all of them. Something is terribly wrong with the many kingdoms. It turns stepmothers into horrible monsters. It destroys everything good within them. Mrs. Bramble grabbed the book of fairy tales from the table beside her. Just read this, my lady. Read it before you make the biggest mistake of your life. Lady Tremaine took the book and smiled at the old woman. I will read it, I promise, she said, trying to make the woman happy and opening the book. What's this, an inscription from Lord Tremaine? She said, taking a closer look. You got this book from Lord Tremaine's library? Why didn't you say so from the start? Lady Tremaine asked. I thought you knew, my lady. He mentioned he brought it at the same shop as your brooch. Lord Tremaine always let the staff borrow his books, my lady, as long as we logged it in his ledger, said Mrs. Bramble. Lady Tremaine knew this was true, of course. This conversation, combined with the events from the last few days, had her head spinning in circles. Well, then I am even happier to have it in my possession, Mrs. Bramble. I will take care to read it. Thank you so much for giving it back. Lady Tremaine motioned to Rebecca to take the old woman out of the room. Now you go back downstairs with Rebecca and stay there and rest until I send for you. Everything will be well, I promise you, she said, kissing Mrs. Bramble on the cheek. She took a deep breath once both ladies were out of the room. Good grief, she said, looking at the book. Seeing Lord Tremaine's handwriting sent a wave of love and sadness through her. She never knew he had gone back to that strange little shop for the book. She remembered the proprietor mentioning it, and she thought it sounded just like something her husband would do, going back to the shop to get it. But she hated the ideas and notions this book had put in Mrs. Bramble's mind. The old woman had clearly convinced herself that the stories were true, and then she remembered her conversation with Sir Richard about whether the book of fairy tales could be a history. Could the stories be true after all? Rebecca came back into the room, interrupting her thoughts. Sit down, my lady. You look pale, she said, holding out a chair for Lady Tremaine. Thank you, Rebecca, dear. Do you know much about the many kingdoms? I swear I remember Sir Richard saying something about a book of fairy tales. She put her hand to her head, and Rebecca took the book from her. Don't worry about that now. I'm sure they are different books. Why don't you lie down? It's been a long day, and tomorrow will be another one. You need your rest. The next morning was spent in a flurry of excitement. As soon as she finished her coffee and was dressed, Lady Tremaine found herself surrounded by a legion of maids, all assisting Rebecca in packing her things so she could make her way back to London to tell her girls the news. She had written ahead to let her butler Avery know she was on her way. She was to instruct the servants to pack up the household and to tell Nanny Pinch to ready the girls for a long journey. Lady Tremaine's head was whirling with everything she had to do, and with everything she and Sir Richard had discussed the night before. He was right to suggest she only bring her personal belongings. It was an extraordinarily long journey to the many kingdoms, after all, and it wasn't sensible to bring everything with her, including her servants. Thank goodness for Rebecca, who was fussing around the room, directing Lady Hackle's staff in the packing of Lady Tremaine's trunks, so she could make her way home on the next train. Lady Tremaine was eager to be reunited with Anastasia and Drizella as soon as possible so she could share the good news. Rebecca, once we're back in London, I want you to supervise the packing of my personal belongings. Dresses, hats, gloves, jewelry, purses, some of my favorite books, and of course the contents of my vanity. Everything else will have to be put into crates and auctioned off. I'll need you to oversee all of that as well. I will have my hands full breaking the news to the girls and meeting with my solicitor so we can arrange the sale of the town house, said Lady Tremaine. Of course, my lady. And what of Miss Anastasia and Miss Drizella's things? Shall I pack for them as well? She asked. No, Nanny Pinch. Nanny Pinch will see to that. I've written ahead. And Rebecca, I need you to work closely with my butler, Avery, to make sure everything is done to my specifications. Rebecca stopped what she was doing. How will Avery and the other servants feel about me swooping in and taking charge like that, my lady? Will they be upset about Mrs. Bramble? Lady Tremaine hadn't even thought of that. Well, Avery is a good sort, but if he does get his nose out of joint, there is nothing we can do, she continued. Oh, Rebecca, there is so much to do, and I have to break it to the staff that I won't be needing them. She was starting to feel faint. My lady, please sit down, Rebecca said. I think you might swoon from all the excitement. I wouldn't worry about your staff. I can't imagine they'd want to travel so far anyway. She had stopped directing the maids in order to give Lady Tremaine her full attention. Yes, I think you're right. Though I do hope Nanny Pinch comes along, even if just for the first few months. She sat down in a pink velvet chair, situated near a window with a little round table beside it. Shall I send down for some tea? Rebecca asked. I know you mean well, always suggesting tea, but if you're going to be my lady's maid, remember, never tea, Rebecca, always coffee. I know that's not very English of me, but I've always preferred it. Rebecca nodded. Yes, my lady, I should have remembered. She motioned to one of the maids to fetch her lady some coffee. There was a knock at the door. Ah, I suppose that couldn't be my coffee already, said Lady Tremaine, laughing. No, my lady, we're still in England, where things don't magically appear as they do in the many kingdoms. Rebecca smiled as she opened the door to Lady Hackle. Lady Tremaine's friend stood there with a look of grave concern on her face. My friend, this letter came for you just now. It's from Sir Richard. He must have sent it right before his ship disembarked. Lady Tremaine took the letter from her friend and read it. My dearest Lady Tremaine, I can't wait another moment for us to be husband and wife. Please come to me as quickly as you can, for I am desperate for you to take your place at my side and in my home. If you love me as much as I hope you do, you will bring Anastasia and Drizella on the next evening voyage. Cinderella and I need you, Sir Richard. Lady Tremaine handed the letter back to her friend so she could read it. Oh, you have to go to him at once, Lady Hackle said. But I'm already leaving as quickly as I can. What of the house in London? Lady Tremaine was distraught. What about the girls? I haven't even told them we are moving. And I must book us all on the next evening voyage? Lady Hackle looked off for a moment, as if she was formulating a plan. Nanny Pinch will just have to bring them to the dock. Hopefully she will agree to come along with you to the many kingdoms. But if she doesn't, the least she can do is bring your girls to meet you at the boat. Your new family needs you. If you had any doubt of his feelings of love toward you, this surely squelches that, she said. I think you're right. But what of the house and the servants? There is so much to do. She took a cup of coffee from a tray that had been brought in by one of the maids. The ship isn't leaving the dock until this evening. That should give Nanny Pinch enough time to get some things together for you and the girls. Piggy and I will go to your place in London tomorrow and supervise everything else and arrange to have the rest of your things shipped to the many kingdoms, said Lady Hackle. Lady Tremaine took her friend's hand. You're such a good friend, Prudence. Thank you, she laughed. It's nothing, my dear friend. It's just a matter of directing your servants. Will you pay them as severance? Should we double the usual under the circumstances? She continued. And what about the house and the things to be auctioned? Is your solicitor handling that? Should Piggy and I stop by his office when I'm in London to make the arrangements for you? Lady Tremaine started to panic. There was so much to be done, and here she was dashing off before she could sort any of it out. Oh, Prudence, would you handle all that, really? I'm afraid I am asking too much of you, my sweet friend. But I have no choice. Lady Hackle laughed. It's for the best possible reason. You're sailing off to be with your love, she said, smiling. This is all happening so quickly. I wanted time to talk with the girls before rushing off to lands unknown, said Lady Tremaine, motioning to one of the servants for another cup of coffee. Lady Hackle put her hands on her friend's shoulders tenderly. You can talk to the girls on the ship. Listen to me, my friend. You are the strongest woman I know. You can do this. You're finally going to have your happily ever after in the land of fairy tales. This is a dream come true.